CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, people. Good to be here. Tony Katz. Tony Katz today. That's the name of the program. Today's show paid for by Hoosiers for Opportunity, Prosperity, and Enterprise, and paid for by Americans for Prosperity, sponsored by Premier Arms, premierarms.com. We have long discussed what is going on with the abuse of children. You have heard me discuss in the world of transgenderism, gender dysphoria. Men are not women, women are not men, boys are not girls, girls are not boys, and children need to be protected more often than not from themselves. This is not a new argument. This is Chloe Cole. Your story is as personal as it gets to the subject. And your story is that you transition, as would be described, and detransition, which no one ever allows that conversation to come to the fore, which is really a story of how outrageously political and violent this is.
Yes.
But people I would argue that people know your name. They may not know the particulars of the story. Me, I wanted to, and because it has been a conversation for the CPAC faithful here, the Conservative Political Action Conference. It certainly has been a conversation for conservatives. It certainly has been a conversation in its like tangential stories about men and women's sports, etc. Take a moment. I know you've told this story a million times in your life, but here's 1,000,001. How does this story start with you questioning, I guess, if I say this right, who you are?
Yeah. From a very young age, I felt like I had issues with my identity and with understanding myself and with being able to present myself to the world. I was a bit on the tomboyish side, I was creative, and I didn't necessarily think like the other people around me. I later learned that I have a learning disability and that I'm possibly on the autism spectrum, but throughout most of my formative years, I didn't really understand this, and I felt like something was wrong with me. I started going through a bit of an early puberty and developing at around the age of 8. And with that came a lot of kind of terrifying attention for a little girl that age. And without much guidance on puberty and the things that I was going through at the time, it was kind of a scary time for me in my life. I ended up going through a sexual assault, and it was one of several things that made me afraid to grow into a woman. And I thought, with what little guidance I had around growing into a woman, that it was just going to be kind of a miserable experience. Like, why would I want to go through periods for half of my life? Why would I want to go through the pains and the uncomfortable tension that comes with being a young female? I would often look at myself in the mirror and think I would have just been so much happier if I were like my older brothers and if I were born a boy and I was my mom and dad's son rather than the daughter. And I started to actually get sucked into this belief that I was a young man when I discovered the transgender community online. So
there's a lot in there that just got mentioned that I don't think people even begin to comprehend. 1, autism spectrum. 2, sexual assault. And then the third, not a recognition, a statement to self of, I don't know if I want to go forward with this. That's an odd thought. I admittedly never had that thought. Of all the things that I've ever had thoughts of, not that one. We often hear that children who are autistic or some level of the spectrum are targeted in this way by adults and others for this transitioning. Do you believe that happened to you?
As in, like, me being targeted specifically?
Right. Did someone speak to you about this because they thought you were on the spectrum and they thought maybe you were an easy target? Or is there just something about possibly being on the spectrum that leads to a questioning that you might be described as irrational?
Well, we know that there is a correlation between gender dysphoria and also being on the autistic spectrum or having like some other cognitive deficit or a learning disability. And speaking as somebody who experiences autistic symptoms myself, like, I feel like it's clear to see the link. when many of us already have a habit of hyperfixating on things, and that's part of what makes puberty so much more difficult for people who are neurodivergent. A lot of parts of life are just more difficult for us, and many of us tend to think outside the box. We tend to think creatively. We tend to be drawn to unique ideas. And while I believe that this is a strength of many neurodivergent people, it also can prove to be our detriment as well. Many of us tend to be very impressionable, and we tend to search for answers when there might not really even be one there, or not really a problem in the first place. And I think that's the deficit for a lot of these children.
Talking to Chloe Cole, talking about being someone who transitioned and then detransitioned, and you never hear about the detransition stories. You never, ever hear those stories. The transitioning. Who were the adults in your life who said, this, you could just leave that right there. Who were the adults in your life who said, this is good for you, you should do this, we'll sign off on this? And what was the regimen, medically or surgically, that you dealt with?
So when I learned about the transgender community online, I was so drawn to it because it was mostly other children who I was seeing who were going through this at different stages of the process. But I noticed that they were all basically just like me. Many of them were creative, many of them were artists, many of them were on the spectrum or had ADHD, and they had a lot of similar struggles and feelings to me while growing up. And they seemed to find this sense of purpose and relief and happiness and identity through the transgender framework of their identity. And I thought that, seeing these other kids who were so similar to me, naturally the next step for me was starting to question it for myself. And I started to fall into this belief that I actually was a young man when I was 12. And I told my mom and dad about these feelings because I wanted to discuss it with them. And I also wanted to move forward with the medical process because that seemed to be presented as the only means of really treating
Hold
this.
with me for a second. Did anybody in that online world, in this supportive world, say to you, hey, you're young, maybe you should just take a breath, maybe still more try to find yourself? Was there anybody offering any level of pause at all in your life?
No, not at all. There really was no talk of things like regret or detransition or grief from transition, or even the fact that it could be wrong or harmful to anybody. I had no idea. I didn't know that detransition was possible until it actually happened to me. So I was going into this being led to think that this was an innate part of me, that this wasn't just a choice that I was making, that I actually, on some deeper level, was transgender and was a young man trapped in the body of a woman.
Was there a push to incept into you the concept of helplessness? That this is just the way it is, this is the way it had to be, and you can't do anything about this. This is just who you are.
That's how they talk about it, yes. They say that this is just, it's an immutable part of somebody, even though there's no sound science, there's nothing really backing it up at all. They will claim that there's years upon years upon years of research backing this, and that there's like some structure. What really drew me into this belief that I actually was a young man was the idea of the brain sex theory, that brains are a sexed organ, which I think is true, but that some people can have the brain of the opposite sex, which has been disproven, actually. I didn't know this at the time, though.
Right.
But as for the medical...
What were the drugs given to you? What was the surgery done to you?
So I was put on Lupron, which actually has been the subject of several different lawsuits because of how horrific of a drug it is to be on. It's previously been used for women with endometriosis, for reproductive conditions and cancers, and also to chemically sterilize sex offenders of children. And I was being put on this as a perfectly healthy child. Because of it, I basically was experiencing menopause at 13 years old. And soon after that, I was put on weekly injections of testosterone, which I took for about 3 years, from 13 to 16. And at 15 years old was when I underwent surgery. I had a double mastectomy, which was the complete removal of my breasts.
Right.
And
right.
all this, you remember. You have to.
It is very different to read this story than hearing this story. It is a very different response mechanism, Chloe, that exists in the soul. Talking to Chloe Cole, you have then, through these peer pressures, through these people, including your parents?
No, my parents they did not want this to happen to me at all. They pushed back, actually. They initially said no to the doctors because they were sane, because they had a good head on their shoulders, and they wanted to just do the right thing for me, which was allowing me to grow up without any intervention, while being allowed to, within appropriate boundaries at the time, express myself through clothing, through different ways of experimenting with my identity that didn't involve harmful procedures. Right. They never believed that I was a boy or their son, or even that I was transgender. But they were lied to about this. They were told that it was going to be a matter of life or death for me, that I would almost certainly kill myself if it weren't for these treatments, even though, as it turned out, the treatments only had brought me closer to suicide because of the regret, because of the grief.
Now, so that's 16. Is that when you detransitioned?
Yes, and that was because the surgery was a big part of what led to that, actually. It was the point where I realized how harmful this actually was to my body and my development into adulthood. And I had this epiphany that one day I wanted to have children, I wanted to become a mother, and I yearned for the ability to nurse and to hopefully have a healthy pregnancy and children of my own naturally one day. And it was then that it really hit me that I was soon to become an adult, but I had lost parts of my adulthood permanently.
When you say you're detransitioning, your friend group, these people who are so supportive, if you will, of making this change, what is their reaction?
They were gone almost immediately. Many of my friends in the transgender community, and even at school outside of it, had silently just left my life. But there were also a few people who actively would go out of their way to harass me just for talking about my experience and just for going through the grieving process, basically. I was told that it was all my fault, that I should have known better, that I was a complete idiot, and that people even tried to pressure me to stay in the transition. Right. They would say, well, you're never going to be pretty ever again. You're never going to be a woman. So why try? What are you doing to yourself? You know that you should have known that this was the right path for you, that it was the wrong path for you. So what are you doing? Are you a fool?
There is much more to this conversation I want to dig into, but I'm a guy pressed on time because that's the way it is. Chloe Cole, before I let you go, a lot of speaking out from you. This is no part of this conversation is easy, and every conversation is you reliving every part of it. Right? That's part of this thing.
And it's not always easy, but it's so worth it.
I have to believe if you didn't think it was worth it, you wouldn't be here. Right? Nobody's doing this for fun. In 30 seconds or less, and I'm going to hold you to 30 seconds. What's the message to parents who have kids dealing with this, or are told they're dealing with this?
Well, you know your child best, and you understand that your child's sex cannot be changed, and that they're beautiful as the boy or as the girl that they are, with all their uniqueness, with all the things that make them different. Those are not things, even though they misunderstand this, those are not things that take away from who they are. You have a responsibility to fight back against the forces that are trying to take your child from you and trying to manipulate your child into believing that there's something that they're not, and help them build their identity in a meaningful and healthy way.
Chloe Cole, where do people find you online?
I am on X, Instagram, and YouTube at CHOOOCOLE, or you can find me by looking up Chloe Cole.
Chloe Cole, I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
More to get to. I'm Tony Katz.